Hey guys, and welcome back. So in this skill, what I want to talk to you about is all about the subject of storage. Now, one big subject that we have to understand for the purposes of the LPIC 2 examination is the concept of RAID. Now, RAID stands for a redundant array of independent disks, and it is primarily focused around fault tolerance. Now, I say primarily because not all RAID devices actually are fault tolerant, which may be a little bit confusing, but we'll get to see what that means very shortly. Now, two big concepts we really want to have distinguished right here. We have the ability to invoke hardware RAID, and when we're talking about hardware RAID, this is controlled by a hardware controller. And when we're talking about hardware RAID, this is also going to be a more expensive implementation. Now, alternatively, we have the option to invoke what is called software RAID, and this is really what we're going to be primarily focused on. So what we're talking about when we mention software RAID, ultimately what we're doing is we're talking about when the kernel itself actually does the job of the hardware RAID controller. Now, the advantage here is that when we invoke software RAID, there is absolutely no need for any type of special hardware. Simply put, we can just do this all within our Linux-based system, and it is very good. Now, if you know anything about RAID, if you have some awareness of it, you will know that we have different RAID levels, and these ultimately provide to us different abilities with respect to performance and with respect to fault tolerance. So let's talk about some of these different RAID levels that we have available to us and what are their advantages and disadvantages when you would want to use one or the other. Now, the first RAID level is called RAID 0. This is otherwise known as striping. Okay, so if you hear the term striping, you want to be thinking about RAID level 0. Now, remember when I said RAID was primarily about fault tolerance, but not always. In fact, with RAID, you may have no level of fault tolerance. What I'm talking about is this level right here. The way I like to remember RAID is that it gives you 0 fault tolerance. So the data is copied 0 times. So why on earth would anyone want to use RAID 0 if it does not provide us fault tolerance? Well, RAID 0 is an example of RAID whereby we are looking at performance, okay? So let me show you how this would kind of shake out. Let's imagine that we had two different hard disks. Okay, so we've got disk 1 here and disk 2. 1 and 2. Now, if we happen to write data to a disk or read data from a disk, now that does take some time, of course. So if we wrote the first piece of data to disk 1, and then once that was done, we could write the second piece of data, and then the third, and then the fourth, so on and so forth. Now, we absolutely could do this, and if we wanted to read that data, we would read from this part of the disk, and then read this part, and then read this part, and then read this part. You kind of get the drift. Now, if we happen to invoke RAID 0, what would actually happen is we would utilize two different disks here. So what we could actually do is we could write the first part of data to this disk and write the second part to this disk, and then write the third to this, and then write the fourth to this. Now, ultimately what you're doing here is you are striping the data across different disks. You're putting a little bit here and a little bit here, and then a little bit here and a little bit here. The effect of this is this improves performance, like I say. It improves the ability to read the data, as well as it improves performance with respect to writing data. The reason why this is because the data can be read and written to concurrently, okay? So we can do things in parallel as opposed to sequentially. The problem though is that this actually is not just giving us no fault tolerance, it's actually reducing our fault tolerance, because if we happen to have disk 1 here and disk 2 here, we write the first part here, the next chunk of data here at the same time, we write the third and then the fourth. You kind of get the drift. Well, if we happen to have some type of fault on this one disk, and this disk becomes unreadable and corrupted, then because we have never actually written any full data to one disk, but only written little parts of that data, ultimately, the data here is also unusable. okay? So we have two disks which are working for high performance, but if only one of those disks gets damaged, the data, which is being chopped up and spread across the two disks, is ultimately unusable. This one because the device itself is actually broken, and this one becomes unusable because you only have half the data you need stored on it, so the data cannot be recovered. As such, because of this, RAID 0 is rarely used. Now, one other thing we also want to be aware of with respect to RAID 0 is that both disks really should be the same size, because if you have disks which are different sizes acting as a RAID 0 array, then ultimately what is going to happen is that you're going to have wasted and unusable space on the larger disk, so it isn't really efficient at all to do such a thing. So you can imagine if you happen to have one disk which was 10 gigs and a larger disk which was 30 gigs, and you put these two in a RAID 0 array, you could only use up to 10 gigabits. That would mean that whilst this part is used, you're going to have 20 gig unused on this disk and effectively just wasted. So another consideration to think about if you happen to choose to go with a RAID 0 array. Now, let's move on to the next one. This one is called RAID 1. Now, RAID 1 actually does give us fault tolerance. The way I like to think of RAID 1 is that it gives us one full copy of our data. This is otherwise known as mirroring, because quite simply, what you're going to do is you're going to mirror the data across different disks. So think about this. If we happen to have, let's say again, disk number 1 and then disk number 2, when we write some data to the first disk, we would write an exact copy to the second disk. So data piece 1 here, data piece 1 here, and then we write data 2, then the second piece of data, the exact copy on the other disk, and then 3 and 3. You kind of get the drift. Now, you actually do get a little bit of a performance advantage here using RAID 1, but only when talking about reading data. The reason why is that you can actually read data from different disks and actually involve some concurrency. So you do get a performance increase for reading data, but there is no increase with respect to writing. Simply put, because you're just having to rewrite the same data over multiple locations. Now, the big advantage here though is that we absolutely do have redundancy here, because if we think about it, if we go back to our analogy, we have disk 1 here and disk 2 with data 1, second piece of data, and let's just say the third, 1, 2, 3. If this disk fails and completely breaks, well, the good news is that we have an exact replica on this disk and all the data is still accessible. Now, using software RAID 1, this is very common. This is one of the more popular implementations of RAID. Simply put, because hard disks are fairly cheap, so it's inexpensive, and it provides you an easy way to have some fault tolerance with respect to your potentially very valuable data. Next, we have a very popular RAID implementation called RAID 5. Now, RAID 5 is a very good option because it gives us an increase in performance and it also gives us redundancy. The unfortunate part here about RAID 5 though is that you need at least 3 disks as a minimum to be able to invoke RAID 5. So let's say we had these 3 disks here. We've got disk 1, disk 2, and then disk 3. So the way the data would be written is you could write the first part here to disk 1, and then the second part to disk 2, and then the third part here to disk 3, and then you would add in something called a parity block. Now what this parity data is, it's simply just data that has been derived from the other data stored on the other devices. Now I'll explain how that works in a little second. So after we write our parity block, we continue on writing our data. We would write the 4th bit here, and then the 5th bit, and then the 6th bit, and then we would write another parity block. And then we continue on writing the 7th bit of data, the 8th, the 9th, and then again, another parity block. Now you'll notice here that this behavior is ultimately a round robin, okay? What we're doing is we're splitting all the data gradually across all the disks, and this is the same for the parity block. Now the purpose of the parity block means that if one disk happened to be destroyed, we could actually still reconstruct the data because of those parity values. Let me give you a rough analogy as to how this is happening. Let's say I had 3 pieces of information here. I say 1 plus 5 equals 6. Okay, that's 3 pieces of information. And you can imagine that spread across 3 different disks. Now, let's say one disk was destroyed, this one here. Okay, so now you no longer know what this number is, but the reality is, based on the information we have on the other disks, we can compare this information and we can actually work out the value here. We can say 1 plus something equals 6. Well, what does that actually mean? 1 plus 5 would equal 6. So even though this disk happens to be destroyed, we can reconstruct it and we would know the value here was 5. This is ultimately what is happening with respect to our parity block. We can reconstruct the data based on the other data on the other redundant disks. And like I say, RAID 5, very, very common indeed. But like I say, in order to be able to invoke this type of parity analysis, we need at least 3 different disks. So next we would go to RAID 10, and the way you can think of RAID 10 as it's like RAID 1 plus RAID 0. So with respect to RAID 10, we get all the performance of RAID 0, so that includes both the reading and writing, so performance both ways there, and the redundancy of having a full mirror, just like we get with RAID 1. So, how on earth is this actually invoked? Well, one of the disadvantages of having to use RAID 10 is that you need a minimum of 4 different disks here. So we'd have 1, 2, and then 3 and 4. Now the way this actually operates is that we can have striped data that is mirrored. Now that sounds confusing, but let me show you what I mean here. So let's say we're writing our first piece of data, let's say data piece number 1, but we're only writing the first half of that data, and we mirror that onto our second disk, so the first half of data. So that data is now mirrored. Now we want to write the other half of that data over here, so 1B, but we want to mirror that information, so we have 1B here. Then we can do 2A here and 2A here, mirroring. And like I say, the data within here is going to be striped with the data over here. So we would do 2B here and mirror it to B here. So on and so forth. The point being is that if we happen to want to read, let's say data number 2 here, we could read the first part from either of these disks and get the second part from either of these disks, so we can read concurrently and build the data. Now, what would happen if one of these devices got destroyed? Well, now 2B is away and 1B is away, but it isn't actually, because we still have a full copy of that data on an entire disk right here, 1B and 2B, and we can still use that to construct the information we have striped across these 2 disks here. So like I say, a lot of advantages with respect to RAID 10. The problem is that, well, you have to have a lot of disks to invoke this type of RAID setup. Now, one distinction I just want to make here is that whilst I have been describing this as using different disks, you can absolutely use different partitions if you so choose. Now remember when we were using fdisk to create a Linux partition? We could create a Linux partition, or we could create something called a swap partition if we so choose. We can also create a partition with a very particular label known as 0xfd. Now what happens is that when we mark a partition with this particular label, what we are ultimately telling the system is, hey, I'm going to be a RAID partition. So you could imagine if you happen to have, let's say, disk number 1, SDA partition 1, and you maybe have a second disk, so SDB partition 1, you could mark both of these partitions as 0xfd, 0xfd, so that we can signal to a Linux system that we are indeed a RAID partition. Now here is the very cool thing here. Let's say we happen to have a particular server, and maybe we had 3 different disks in here, or 3 different partitions, whatever it may be. If they have that marking, denoting them as a RAID partition, i.e. with the FD marking, even if this actual server here itself, let's say some internal component blows and the server is not operational, what you could do is you could just open up this server, grab these 3 devices which have been marked as RAID arrays, and you could just slip them in to another server that is running Linux, and what that server will do, it will automatically assemble these drives exactly as they were before. So this is super handy because if you think about it, if you happen to have 3 different disks, like I say, and this was a Debian server, and for whatever reason this breaks, you could pull these 3 out, no problem at all. And even if you go over to some type of Red Hat distribution and dump in those 3 disks, automatically the system is going to detect they are RAID arrays and assemble them no problem at all, even though they came from a completely different operating system. One being Debian based, one being Red Hat, it does not matter. So software RAID really is a very useful and important solution with respect to improving performance and primarily improving your resiliency to potential failures of your disk via redundancy. So what we want to do now is to look at some of the basic configurations of how we can set up software RAID on our Linux machines. That's what we'll be talking about in the very next nugget. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.